The morning had started like any other for Ayanna. The sun was just rising over the city, casting long, soft shadows across the quiet streets. She walked briskly, clutching her bag close, her mind full of small tasks and little worries, groceries, work, calls she needed to make. Life felt ordinary, almost peaceful. But in the blink of an eye, that peace would shatter, leaving her heart pounding and her mind racing. Ayanna had always been careful. She knew how the world could be harsh, especially for someone like her, a black woman navigating streets that sometimes felt as unpredictable as the wind. She was aware of the whispers, the sideways glances, and the invisible barriers that made life feel heavier than it should. Yet, she had learned to move forward with dignity, keeping her head high and her heart open. Today, however, dignity would meet its first test. As she approached the small corner cafe where she usually stopped for coffee, she noticed something strange. 2 unmarked black cars had pulled over near the entrance. They were ordinary-looking vehicles, nothing flashy, yet something about their sudden stop made her stomach tighten. Before she could even question it, 2 men in dark uniforms stepped out. Their badges glinted faintly in the morning sunlight, but their faces were unreadable, masked by dark sunglasses. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," one of them said in a tone that left no room for discussion. There was no smile, no explanation, just authority in its rawest form. Ayanna froze. She had never been in trouble before. She had no record, no reason to fear the law. Her mind raced for answers, for some logical explanation. But the officers offered none. They simply moved closer, their presence heavy and oppressive. "Why? What did I do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the panic creeping up her spine. "Please cooperate," the second officer replied, his voice low, calm, but firm. "You will understand soon." The words did nothing to calm her. In fact, they made the situation more terrifying. There was no explanation, no chance to argue, just a cold, mechanical demand that she follow their orders. Panic mixed with disbelief as her hands instinctively went to her chest, feeling for some control she didn't have. They cuffed her hands quickly, efficiently. The metal was cold against her skin, a shocking reminder of how sudden her world had changed. She struggled slightly, more out of instinct than real resistance, but the officers held her firmly. Ayanna's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the fear that seemed to surround her like a dense fog. As they led her to the vehicles, bystanders began to notice. Some stared silently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Others whispered to one another, pointing, shaking their heads. Ayanna could hear fragments of their conversations, but it all felt distant, almost unreal. It was as if the world had slowed, focusing solely on her and the dark uniforms that had suddenly entered her life. Inside the car, the air was tense and heavy. Ayanna tried to make sense of what was happening. Who were these officers? Why was she being taken like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong? She searched their faces for a hint, a clue, anything that could explain this nightmare, but found nothing. Only eyes covered by dark sunglasses, expressionless, unreadable. Memories of her life flashed through her mind, her childhood, her dreams, the small victories she had worked for so hard. She thought of her mother's voice, firm yet comforting, "Keep your head high, Ayanna. No one can take your dignity if you don't let them." Those words grounded her for a moment, but the reality outside the car window was harsh and unyielding. The vehicle moved swiftly through the streets, taking routes unfamiliar to her. Each turn heightened the suspense, each stoplight a reminder that she was not in control. She pressed her hands against the cuffs, testing their strength, seeking some flaw, some chance to reclaim her freedom. But they were tight, unyielding, a symbol of the sudden, inexplicable injustice that had befallen her. Ayanna tried to speak again, her voice breaking through the tension. "Please, someone tell me what's happening." But her words were met with silence. The officers exchanged brief, quiet glances, but said nothing. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the seatbelt locks. Hours, or perhaps it was minutes, time had begun to lose its meaning, passed in this tense, uncertain journey. Ayana's mind spun, trying to piece together the fragments of a reality that seemed more like a nightmare than life. She remembered her friends, her coworkers, the small community that knew her well. Would they even believe what was happening? Would anyone know how completely her life had been turned upside down? Finally, the car stopped. Ayana's heart jumped. She looked around, trying to see where they had brought her. The location was unfamiliar, isolated, far from the city streets she knew. The officers opened the doors, their movements smooth and practiced, almost mechanical. They led her out, and for the first time, she saw it, a massive helicopter waiting on a deserted helipad, its rotors spinning lazily, casting long, dancing shadows on the ground. Fear struck her chest like lightning. A helicopter? What could this possibly mean? The officers guided her closer, their hands firm, unrelenting. Ayana's mind raced faster than ever, trying to understand the impossibility of the situation. She was handcuffed, completely exposed, and yet, something deep inside her stirred, not just fear, but determination. As she stepped onto the helipad, the wind picked up, buffeting her hair and clothes. The noise of the rotors filled her ears, making it almost impossible to think clearly. But she refused to let panic take over completely. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to run, to escape. Yet she knew she was physically restrained, powerless in the hands of those who held her. Then, the officers said the words that would haunt her memory forever, "Step inside." Ayana's pulse raced. She looked at them, searching for any sign of reason or mercy, but found none. They were statues of authority, cold and unyielding. And in that moment, as she faced the gaping door of the helicopter, she realized just how high the stakes had become. One wrong move, one falter, and everything could end in disaster. But even in the shadow of fear, a small flame of resolve lit within her. She would not give up so easily. She had survived before, faced challenges that seemed impossible. And now, even handcuffed and surrounded, she would find a way to turn the tables, even if she didn't yet know how. The helicopter waited, the officers guided her closer, and the city below seemed to fade into insignificance. The moment was frozen, the tension palpable, the world holding its breath. And in that silence, Ayana made a silent promise to herself: whatever happened next, she would not be defeated. The first step onto the helicopter was taken, and the unknown began. Fear and suspense wrapped around her like a thick cloak, and the story that had seemed ordinary just hours ago had transformed into something far beyond her control. Ayana stepped into the helicopter, her heart hammering in her chest. The wind roared around them, shaking the craft, and the rotors spun with a deafening sound that made her pulse race even faster. The officers pushed her toward a small, metal seat, and she felt the cold chains bite into her wrists. The helicopter wasn't moving yet, but the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on her like a stone. She tried to steady her breathing, but every instinct in her body screamed danger. The air smelled sharp, mixed with oil and metal. She could hear the low murmur of the pilots in front, their words muffled but urgent. The officers behind her whispered instructions that made no sense, threats wrapped in calm voices, but Ayana barely heard them. Her mind was spinning, searching for a way out of this nightmare. The city below looked small from the helipad, a patchwork of streets and buildings that now seemed far away, distant and untouchable. Ayana's thoughts flickered to her family and friends. What would they think if they knew what was happening? She felt a surge of fear but also a surge of determination. She would not let herself become just another victim in someone else's plan. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, the wind tore at her clothes and hair. The motion made her stomach churn, and she gripped the seat chains tightly, testing them subtly with each movement. They were strong, cold, and unyielding, but she noticed a slight looseness in the right cuff. A tiny detail, almost invisible, but a spark of hope ignited inside her. The officers were tense, their eyes scanning her constantly. Ayana could feel their suspicion, their constant attempts to anticipate her next move. But she had learned to mask her fear. She forced herself to appear calm, almost submissive, letting the tension build in silence. Each second felt like a trap, and each breath was a careful calculation. Suddenly, the helicopter tilted sharply, and Ayana was pressed sideways against the wall. Her heart jumped. One of the officers reached for her arm, checking the cuffs as if expecting her to break free. She forced a small, nervous laugh, keeping her face neutral. "Careful," she said softly, though the words barely rose above the roar of the rotors. Hours, or maybe only minutes, passed as the helicopter carried them over forests, rivers, and winding roads. Ayana tried to memorize every detail, every shadow, every sound. She noticed the subtle differences in the officer's movements, the way one shifted his weight slightly before speaking, the brief flicker of impatience in the other's eyes. Every tiny clue could become a lifeline if she stayed sharp. Then, as the helicopter reached a remote area far from the city, the officers opened the side door. The wind rushed in violently, nearly knocking Ayana off balance. She looked down and saw nothing but a dizzying drop of hundreds of feet, the earth spinning beneath her like a living map. Fear gripped her chest like iron, but she did not panic. Panic would only give them control. "Step closer," one officer ordered. The words were flat, like a command from a machine. Ayana's hands trembled slightly, but her mind raced faster. She needed to assess everything: the rope harnesses, the chains, the door itself. One wrong step could mean the end, but one clever move could turn the situation entirely in her favor. As she was guided to the edge, she noticed a small tool tucked into her boot, a pin she had kept for emergencies, almost forgotten. Her heart raced. It was not much, but it could be enough. She kept her eyes calm, careful not to show any hint of the plan forming in her mind. The officers would never suspect her courage, her resourcefulness. They expected fear, and she would give them the appearance of it, while her mind worked tirelessly on escape. The wind howled around her, tugging at her hair and clothes. The helicopter tilted dangerously, and she caught herself, gripping the metal seat with one hand while subtly testing the chains with the other. The chain on her right wrist, slightly loose, gave her a glimmer of hope. She could feel her pulse quicken, not just from fear, but from the surge of adrenaline that comes when survival and courage collide. Then, one officer moved too close, leaning over her to adjust the chains. In that moment, Ayana acted. She shifted her weight subtly, pulling her arm just enough to unbalance him slightly. The officer stumbled, surprised, and Ayana's mind raced. This was only the first step, a tiny misdirection, but enough to remind them that she was not entirely helpless. The officers reacted immediately, their eyes narrowing, their grips tightening. But Ayana was calm. She let them think they were still in control, even as she quietly calculated her next move. The suspense hung in the air, thick and suffocating, each second stretching like an eternity. The audience below, or anyone who could see, would never understand how close she was to breaking free. And in that moment, Ayana made a silent vow. She would survive this. She would turn the impossible into her advantage. Even handcuffed, even outnumbered, even facing certain danger, she would not give in. The helicopter roared above the remote land, the wind screaming around her, and the stage was set. Something extraordinary was about to happen, and the officers would soon realize that the woman they underestimated was far more resourceful than they had ever imagined. The helicopter tilted again, sharper this time, and Ayana felt the floor shift beneath her. The wind ripped at her clothes, tugging her hair across her face, but she barely flinched. Every muscle in her body was tense, every sense alert. She was fully aware of the danger, but deep inside, she felt a strange clarity. Fear had not broken her, it had sharpened her. The officers were focused, scanning every move she made. One of them stepped closer, checking the chains once more. Ayana's mind raced. The loose cuff on her right wrist, the small pin hidden in her boot, and the officer's predictable movements, all pieces of a puzzle that she could solve if she stayed calm. The helicopter wasn't just a trap, it was a challenge, and she was determined to win. Suddenly, the officer leaned too far, trying to steady her against the door. Ayana shifted her weight, barely a whisper of movement, and he lost his balance. The others reacted immediately, shouting, but the chaos had begun. The helicopter wobbled slightly, sending a wave of adrenaline through everyone on board. Ayana's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the thrill of taking her first step toward turning the situation around. She glanced at the open door. Below stretched hundreds of feet of air and earth. Her first thought was fear, but quickly, her survival instincts kicked in. She could not panic, she had to think. Her hand brushed the pin tucked in her boot, and she felt the tiny, cold metal against her skin, a reminder that she still had a chance, that she was not powerless. The wind screamed louder, whipping around the cabin and rattling the metal frames. The officers tried to regain control, but their focus had been broken. Ayana used the moment to test the chains, pulling subtly. The right cuff moved just enough to give her hope. Each second stretched painfully, the tension building like a coiled spring. The audience, anyone imagining the scene, would feel the suffocating pressure, the danger that could explode at any moment. Then came a small, sharp click. One officer had tried to grab the pin from her boot without noticing her subtle movement. Ayana reacted instinctively, pushing slightly against him. He stumbled back, losing his balance for a split second. In that instant, the helicopter tilted dangerously, and the officers clutched at anything to stabilize themselves. Ayana held her seat, her eyes calm, hiding the spark of cunning in her mind. For a brief moment, silence fell, a tense, suffocating pause where only the sound of the rotors filled the cabin. Ayana's mind raced, she needed to exploit every weakness, every second of hesitation. She could feel the officers' frustration, their confusion, their disbelief that she had not cowered completely. The tension was electric, and in that moment, she knew she had planted the first seed of chaos that could save her. The helicopter hovered over a remote stretch of land, a narrow canyon below offering both danger and opportunity. Ayana's thoughts flickered to survival, to escape, to the possibility of outsmarting the people who had tried to make her powerless. The officers' eyes never left her, but their attention was now divided. She had created a distraction, a crack in their control, and she was ready to exploit it. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the open door, and Ayana instinctively leaned back, keeping herself from being pushed forward. One officer shouted, pointing at her, but she remained calm, letting the chaos around her serve as a shield. The helicopter rocked violently, and she realized that she had forced a small but crucial change in the balance of power. The officer's confidence was shaken, and she had discovered a spark of her own power. Ayana's hands ached from the chains, but she ignored the discomfort. Every move had to be calculated, every second measured. She shifted slightly, testing the limits of the restraints, and a tiny grin flickered across her face. They had underestimated her. They thought fear would make her weak. They did not know the determination that burned inside her, the courage that refused to be broken, even in the face of impossible danger. Then came the moment that changed everything. With a sudden, calculated movement, Ayana used her body weight to force the nearest officer off balance completely. He stumbled toward the open door, clutching at the metal frame, and the helicopter tilted dangerously. The other officer lunged to stabilize him, but in doing so, left a small but critical opening. Ayana's mind raced, this was her chance. One more clever action could turn the impossible into an opportunity. The rotor wind howled, the helicopter tilted, and Ayana's pulse surged. She was no longer just a victim, she was an active force in the chaos, a spark of intelligence and courage that had begun to unsettle even the trained officers. Fear had not defeated her, it had sharpened her, made her acutely aware of every detail, every movement, every chance to survive. And in that moment, high above the earth, with danger pressing on all sides, Ayana realized that her life would never be the same again. The helicopter had become not just a prison, but a stage where she could prove that courage, intelligence, and determination could overcome even the most impossible odds. The first wave of chaos had passed, but the real test was just beginning. Ayana's eyes flicked to the open door, the spinning rotors, and the uncertain earth below. She was ready. Every instinct, every ounce of determination, was focused on the next move. The officers would soon discover that the woman they thought helpless was far more resourceful, far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The helicopter hovered over the canyon, the wind screaming, the rotors shaking the cabin, and Ayana took a deep breath. The real battle for survival, and for justice, was about to begin. The helicopter roared above the canyon, the rotors spinning violently, shaking the metal cabin. Ayana's heart pounded, but she moved with careful precision, hiding her plan behind the mask of fear. The officers thought they had control, they thought she was just a scared, handcuffed woman. They couldn't have been more wrong. One officer reached toward her again, his grip firm but slightly hesitant now. The stumble earlier had shaken his confidence, and Ayana sensed it instantly. Every slight hesitation, every distracted glance, was an opportunity. She had been watching, studying, waiting. And now, the moment had come. Ayana shifted her weight subtly, leaning just enough to loosen the chain on her right wrist. She had been practicing this movement silently for what felt like hours, pretending to be exhausted and fearful. The chain gave way slightly, and her pulse surged, not from panic, but from excitement. The first part of her plan was working. The officer nearest her moved to tighten the cuffs, and she acted. In one swift motion, she pushed against him, using his own momentum to destabilize him. He stumbled, flailing for balance, and his foot hit a loose panel on the floor. The clang echoed sharply in the cabin, and the other officer's attention snapped toward him. Ayana saw her chance. She leaned forward, pulling against the chain while keeping her weight centered. The chain slipped just enough for her hand to move slightly, enough to reach the small pin hidden in her boot. With practiced ease, she grabbed it, feeling the cold metal press into her palm. Every second felt stretched, every movement a calculated risk. The first officer regained balance and lunged toward her, shouting in surprise. Ayana stayed calm, her breathing controlled, her eyes focused. She used the pin to unlock the right cuff just enough to free a small movement of her wrist. The officer didn't notice the subtle shift, assuming she was still helpless. But now, she had a small advantage, just enough to make a difference. The helicopter tilted dangerously over the canyon, and the wind roared into the cabin, lifting papers and small objects into the air. Ayana's hair whipped around her face, but she ignored the chaos. She could feel the officers' tension rising, their nerves fraying as they tried to anticipate her next move. And she let them think they were still in control. Then came the moment that stunned everyone. With a precise twist, Ayana used the small movement in her right wrist to push one officer backward toward the open door. He stumbled, clutching at the cabin wall, but the tilt of the helicopter made his grip unsure. The other officer reacted instantly, trying to stabilize his partner, but in doing so, he left himself exposed. Ayana's eyes flicked between them, calculating, focused. She wasn't just reacting, she was controlling the chaos. Each officer's movement was predictable, each panic-stricken glance a clue. She had turned fear into power, and the officers realized, too late, that the woman they underestimated was anything but helpless. The cabin was a storm of wind, metal, and tension. The officers shouted, trying to regain control, but their commands were fragmented, lost in the roar of the rotors. Ayana's small actions had created a ripple of confusion, and in that chaos, she found her strength. Her heart raced, adrenaline fueling every careful movement. She leaned back slightly, keeping her balance while subtly testing the left cuff. It was tighter than the right, but she noticed a small flaw, a tiny gap near the hinge. She pressed her fingers into it, feeling the metal give slightly under pressure. A plan formed in her mind, clear and dangerous. She would not just survive, she would seize the moment, turning the helicopter into the stage for her first major victory. The officers' faces were masks of shock and disbelief. They had expected fear, tears, obedience. What they faced instead was calm, intelligence, and courage. Ayana's eyes met theirs briefly, and in that glance, the tension spoke louder than words. They could see it, they had misjudged her. And then, just as the helicopter tilted once more, Ayana made her next move. A sudden push of weight sent the nearest officer stumbling fully toward the open door. The second officer lunged instinctively, and for a fraction of a second, both men were off balance. Ayana gripped the chains with her freed hand, twisting, pulling, and stabilizing herself. The roar of the helicopter filled the cabin, the wind whipped around them, and Ayana's heart pounded in rhythm with the blades above. The officers were shocked, scrambling, struggling to regain control, and the first real taste of her cleverness had left them unprepared. Ayana had created the first real chaos. She had taken the impossible, being handcuffed, outnumbered, trapped in a helicopter hundreds of feet above the ground, and begun to rewrite it. Fear was no longer her enemy, it was her tool. Every instinct, every careful movement, was now a weapon. And as the helicopter hovered above the canyon, spinning slightly in the gusting wind, Ayana knew one thing with certainty: the officers had underestimated her completely. The next moments would decide everything. She was no longer a victim. She was a force to be reckoned with, and they were about to find out, in the most shocking way possible. The helicopter tilted sharply, throwing everyone off balance. Ayana gripped the chains with her freed hand, her mind racing faster than the blades above. The wind screamed in her ears, tearing at her hair and clothes, but she barely noticed. Her focus was absolute, every movement, every glance calculated to stay one step ahead of the officers who had underestimated her. The first officer stumbled against the metal floor, trying to regain control after Ayana's clever push. His partner lunged to stabilize him, but in doing so, they left openings Ayana had been waiting for. The small gap in her left cuff called to her, a chance to gain more freedom. She pressed against it subtly, feeling the metal give slightly under pressure. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the thrill of control. "You think you can trick me?" the first officer shouted, frustration and disbelief mixing in his voice. Ayana didn't answer. Instead, she let her calm demeanor speak louder than words. Every twitch of her hand, every careful lean, was a signal to herself and a warning to them: she was no longer helpless. The helicopter rocked violently, gusts of wind slamming through the open door. Ayana's eyes flicked toward it, measuring the drop below, imagining possibilities. She didn't panic. She had calculated risk, and she knew the slightest movement, at the right moment, could give her complete advantage. The officers, desperate to maintain control, were growing sloppy. Their confidence had eroded with every small stumble, every sudden tilt, and every subtle movement Ayana had forced. A loud clang echoed in the cabin as one officer's foot hit a loose panel, sending a wave of tension through the confined space. Ayana seized the opportunity, pushing against the nearest wall to twist her body just enough to slip her hand a little farther. The cuff loosened slightly, and her fingers brushed the pin again. It was a small victory, but in this high-stakes moment, small victories mattered more than anything. The officers shouted, lunging toward her, but Ayana was already thinking 2 moves ahead. She used their momentum against them, shifting her weight to destabilize the nearest officer again. He flailed toward the open door, and the other officer had no choice but to grab him, leaving a critical opening between them. Ayana's heart raced. This was the moment she had been waiting for. With precision born of fear and instinct, she twisted her body, using her freed hand to push and pull in perfect timing. The officers staggered, shouting orders, their frustration mounting. Ayana's calm focus contrasted sharply with their panic, and the difference was palpable. The helicopter's rotors roared overhead, wind buffeting the cabin violently, adding to the chaos she had now created. Her mind raced. The canyon below stretched wide and deep, a dizzying expanse of rock and air. Ayana could almost taste freedom, but she had to be careful. One wrong move, one moment of overconfidence, and the fall could be deadly. She pressed her fingers into the loose cuff again, testing it, willing it to give just a little more. The officers were scrambling now, shouting at each other, trying to regain control. Their coordinated strength had fractured, leaving them vulnerable. Ayana's heart leapt, not with fear, but with determination. Every second that passed, the balance of power shifted further in her favor. She was no longer reacting, she was controlling the chaos. Then came the moment of decision. The first officer lunged for her once more, but Ayana was ready. Using the tiny movement she had gained from the cuff, she twisted and leaned, sending him stumbling again toward the open door. The second officer reached to stabilize him, but it was too late. The gap between them was widening. Ayana's eyes flicked to the canyon below, calculating the risk, imagining the impossible. The helicopter rocked again, violently this time, the wind screaming like a living thing. The officer's shouts became frantic, almost panicked. Ayana stayed calm, her every movement precise, her mind working faster than the storm surrounding her. She had created chaos, tested their reactions, and now she had the upper hand, even if only slightly. In the span of a few minutes, she had transformed from a handcuffed prisoner into a cunning strategist. Fear had not broken her, it had sharpened her senses, honed her instincts, and made her aware of every tiny detail in the cabin. She was alive, aware, and ready to turn the impossible into her advantage. And as the helicopter hovered over the canyon, the wind screaming and the rotors shaking the cabin, Ayana's thoughts were clear: the officers had underestimated her completely. They had assumed fear would make her weak. They had assumed she would obey. They had assumed wrong. The stage was set, the chaos was hers, and the next moments would decide everything. Ayana's pulse raced, adrenaline fueling every calculated movement. The impossible was within reach. She was no longer just a victim, she was a force, and the officers would soon realize it in the most shocking way. The helicopter tilted violently, and Ayana gripped the chains with one hand while subtly testing the loosened cuff with the other. Her pulse was racing, but her mind was calm, focused. The chaos she had created moments ago had shaken the officer's confidence, and now, she was ready to take full advantage. The first officer lunged toward her again, his movements desperate and uncontrolled. Ayana leaned slightly, using his momentum against him. He stumbled, almost falling toward the open door. The second officer reached to grab him, leaving himself exposed. Ayana's eyes flicked between them, her mind calculating every tiny opportunity. This was it, the moment she could act decisively. With a swift, controlled motion, she used the pin from her boot to unlock the right cuff completely. The cold metal slipped off her wrist, and a surge of power ran through her. She could move freely, even slightly, and the officers did not notice immediately. Their focus was still on stabilizing each other, still believing they had control. Ayana moved with precision. She twisted her body, pushing the first officer closer to the open door. The second officer lunged instinctively, but she shifted her weight again, creating a small but critical gap between them. The wind howled through the open helicopter, throwing debris and rattling the cabin, adding to the confusion she had engineered. Her movements were subtle, almost invisible, but the effect was devastating. The officers were off balance, struggling to regain control, while Ayana's confidence grew. She had turned fear into a weapon. Every step, every lean, every pull against the chains had been carefully calculated. Now, she was not just surviving, she was dominating. The helicopter hovered above the canyon, and Ayana's eyes scanned the terrain below. Hundreds of feet of empty air stretched beneath her, dizzying and dangerous. Yet she was not afraid. She had planned for every moment, every contingency. The officers had assumed she was powerless, but they had underestimated her intelligence, her courage, and her ability to act under extreme pressure. With a sudden twist, she used the free hand to shove the nearest officer fully against the helicopter wall. He crashed with a clang, stunned and disoriented. The other officer tried to intervene, but Ayana anticipated his move. With another precise motion, she pushed him toward the opposite side, forcing both men to struggle against the chaos she controlled. The helicopter rocked violently, the rotors screaming above them, but Ayana stayed perfectly balanced. Her mind raced, calculating her next move, considering every angle. She had not just created confusion, she had orchestrated it, turning the helicopter cabin into her stage. She was no longer a victim, she was a force that the officers could not contain. Then came the critical moment. The first officer, desperate, lunged again. Ayana twisted her body sharply, using her momentum to send him stumbling past the open door. The second officer reacted too late, trying to grab him, and the balance of power had shifted completely. Both men were disoriented, struggling to regain control, while Ayana's calm, precise movements allowed her to stay steady and safe. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she kept it under control. Every second counted. She had turned the impossible into an opportunity. The officers, who had thought they were in control, were now reacting to her every move. Their fear and confusion mirrored the suspense that gripped the audience. Every viewer, imagining the scene, would feel the tension, the danger, and the awe of Ayana's courage. Ayana's eyes flicked once more to the canyon below. It was dizzying, terrifying, but also full of possibilities. The helicopter's rotors roared, the wind screamed, and the cabin shook with chaos. And in that moment, she realized something profound: she had survived because she had refused to be powerless. Fear had sharpened her senses, clarified her instincts, and given her the courage to act when it mattered most. The officers were stunned, their confidence shattered. Ayana had taken control, turned the tables, and proven that she was far more resourceful and courageous than they had ever imagined. The helicopter hovered, teetering on the edge of danger, and for the first time, she felt that escape, or at least the upper hand, was within reach. Her heart pounded, but she was calm. Every movement from here on would be calculated, deliberate, and unstoppable. She had started as a handcuffed prisoner, trapped and powerless, but now she was the one who dictated the chaos. The impossible had become hers, and the officers were helpless to stop her. Ayana knew the next moments would define everything. She had turned the situation completely in her favor, but the story was far from over. The helicopter, the wind, and the officers' desperate attempts to regain control meant danger was still alive, but she was ready. She was not just surviving anymore. She was winning. The helicopter tilted sharply again, the wind screaming and tearing at the cabin like a wild force of nature. Ayana's heart pounded, but she moved with absolute precision. The officers were scrambling, off balance, and utterly unprepared for the calm determination in her eyes. Every instinct she had honed during this nightmare told her this was the moment to act decisively. The first officer, still dazed from her earlier maneuvers, lunged at her again. Ayana twisted her body, using his momentum to shove him away from her. He stumbled dangerously close to the open door, gripping at the frame with desperation. The second officer tried to intervene, but she anticipated his movement perfectly. A quick shift of her weight sent him sliding toward the far wall, leaving both men disoriented and struggling to recover. Ayana's mind raced. She had planned for this, imagined every possibility, but reality was even more intense. The wind roared, the helicopter swayed, and her pulse matched the deafening rhythm of the rotors. Her hands, one free and one still restrained, worked with calm precision. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, and focused on survival. Then came the moment that would define everything. Ayana saw the first officer lose his grip entirely. The open door yawned behind him, the dizzying drop below like a living threat. Without hesitation, she leaned just enough to stabilize herself while letting him stumble forward. Time seemed to slow, the wind, the noise, the chaos all merged into a single, frozen moment. The officers shouted, but it was too late. Their attempts to regain control failed, and Ayana's quick thinking had left them powerless. She didn't gloat, didn't move carelessly. She stayed focused, using the small advantage she had won to maintain balance and control. Her eyes scanned the cabin, measuring every possibility, every movement, every risk. The helicopter roared, spinning slightly over the canyon. Ayana's mind worked faster than ever. She needed to secure her position fully. With careful precision, she used her freed hand to pull herself closer to the cabin center, stabilizing against the metal wall. The officers, shaken and exhausted, could barely react. Their confidence was shattered, their authority broken by a woman they had underestimated. Ayana's gaze flicked to the canyon below. Hundreds of feet of empty air stretched beneath her, dizzying and terrifying, yet alive with possibility. The wind battered the cabin, rattling metal, shaking the helicopter violently, but she did not waver. Fear had been transformed into focus, panic into strategy. She had become a force that could not be contained. The officers tried to recover, but the subtle chaos she had created was now fully in her control. Every movement they made was anticipated, countered, or redirected. Ayana had turned the impossible into her advantage. The helicopter was no longer a prison, it was her stage, her arena. And in this arena, she was untouchable. Finally, the first officer collapsed against the cabin wall, exhausted and defeated. The second officer sank to his knees, panting, realizing fully that they had been outmatched. Ayana stood, steady and composed, the chains of one wrist still cold but irrelevant compared to the power she had seized. Her eyes, calm and focused, reflected the triumph of courage, intelligence, and determination over fear and brute force. The wind screamed around them, the helicopter rocked, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. Ayana's chest rose and fell steadily, her mind clear. She had survived, she had outsmarted, and she had dominated a situation that seemed utterly hopeless just hours before. The officers could only watch in stunned silence. Ayana's thoughts were simple, yet profound. She had refused to be a victim. She had refused to let fear dictate her actions. And in the end, her courage, her cleverness, and her unwavering resolve had turned the tables completely. The impossible had become hers, and the officers who had thought they held power now realized the truth: they had been utterly outmatched by a woman they underestimated. The helicopter stabilized, the rotors still screaming, but the threat had passed. Ayana's body was tense, her mind alert, yet a quiet satisfaction settled over her. She had survived the nightmare, she had claimed control, and she had proven that no one could take her power away, no matter how dire the situation. The helicopter finally descended toward a quiet, remote landing zone. The rotor's deafening roar softened as it touched the ground, and Ayana's body relaxed slightly, though her mind remained alert. She had survived the impossible, outsmarted the officers, and transformed fear into strength. Every pulse of adrenaline, every calculated movement, had brought her to this moment. As the engines hummed softly, she looked around at the stunned officers. Their faces were pale, filled with disbelief, frustration, and the slow realization that they had underestimated her completely. Ayana felt a mix of satisfaction and calm clarity. She had not only survived, they would never forget her courage, her intelligence, or the way she turned a desperate situation into triumph. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Hours ago, she had been an ordinary woman, walking down city streets, unaware of how suddenly life could change. One wrong assumption, one moment of injustice, had led her into chaos, danger, and fear. Yet she had refused to surrender. She had acted with careful calculation, courage, and resilience. The chains that once bound her were no longer relevant, they had been overcome by determination, resourcefulness, and willpower. She realized that power was not given, it was taken, earned through bravery and quick thinking. Every step she had taken, every calculated risk, had taught her that even in the direst circumstances, hope and courage could turn the impossible into reality. As she stepped off the helicopter, the wind brushing her face and the canyon stretching behind her, Ayana felt a strange sense of freedom. Not the freedom of escaping danger, though she had, but the freedom that came from knowing she could face any challenge, any injustice, without fear controlling her actions. She had become stronger, wiser, and more unshakable than she had ever imagined. For a moment, she paused, looking at the officers. They were no longer threats, they were a reminder of the world's assumptions, of the underestimation and prejudice that so often defined others' actions. But she no longer feared it. Instead, she felt empowered. She had taken control, and no one could take that from her. Ayana's mind drifted to her family and friends, to the life she had before this ordeal. She knew it would never be the same, but that was not a loss, it was a transformation. She had faced the impossible, and in doing so, had discovered a strength she had never fully recognized. The world could challenge her, try to trap her, and push her to the edge, but she would always rise, clever, brave, and unstoppable. As the helicopter's engines powered down and silence returned, Ayana walked away with steady steps. The sun was higher now, warm and illuminating the canyon below. Every gust of wind, every shadow, every challenge she had faced had been a test, and she had passed with courage and intelligence. She knew the story would live on, not just in memory, but in the truth it carried, that fear could be transformed into power, that courage could rewrite destiny, and that even in the most impossible circumstances, one person could defy expectation and change everything. Ayana took a deep breath, feeling the wind against her face. She had survived. She had conquered. And she had become something greater than the situation that had tried to break her. The world had expected fear and submission, but what they got was strength, intelligence, and the unbreakable courage of a woman who refused to be powerless. And as she disappeared into the horizon, her mind clear and her spirit unshakable, Ayana carried with her a quiet truth: the impossible is never final, and courage can transform even the darkest, most desperate moments into triumph.